Okay, I just want to make note for everyone that I just put in the chat the link to the survey, the certificate, and recordings of this um, workshop today and the two previous ones. It'll be the same location for all 5 of them. So if you want to make note of that, copy it now. I'll put it in again at the end of the workshop too.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to everybody's feedback. I know it's a busy time during the summer. People are away from work, getting a break, which is great. But we did have a lot of people that attended our resilience training in the spring that really wanted more information on self-care. And we thought it would be wonderful to invite some of our partners and certainly PhD students from Illinois. I was attending a self-care series last summer through Illinois Extension and was introduced to all of the PhD students that are doing fantastic research related to self-care. And I thought, boy, we should really bring that program to New York State and introduce the important work that they're doing and actually learning how to take better care of ourselves. So that's why we offered and put this program together. And I'm hoping we can do more connections with Extension in other states, because Extension is doing wonderful research across the country, and we just often don't know what's really happening. And it's really nice to be connected and to really offer the education and the information that's really being developed across the country through the land-grant university system. So Illinois University at Urbana-Champaign is one of the land-grant universities. It's really the land-grant university for the state of Illinois. Cornell is our land-grant university in New York State. And that's why a lot of our work and research coming out of Cornell is shared with people in New York State. But with the land-grant university system and Extension, we have actually research happening in every state of the union. There is a land-grant university in every state, and we have extension work happening in every state. So it's wonderful when we can partner with other states and bring that research, to our local communities. So we're excited that we have this program today, that we've been able to put a series together for the summer and to welcome everyone to our program. We'll give people a couple more minutes to join us, and hopefully we can have a few more people learning with us today. And we do have a couple programs coming up in the next 2 weeks on Tuesday from 12 to 1. On August 3rd, we have a program on free radical fighters, understanding the importance of antioxidants. So we'll be talking about diet next Tuesday. And then the following week, we're going to be talking about sleep and how how sleep impacts the functioning of the brain. So we hope you will join us for the last 2 programs, as well as our program today, which is on phthalates, BPA, and the developing brain. And as Karen suggested, we would like to have your feedback. We'd like you to complete the evaluation. She put that in the chat so that we know if this program is helpful to you. And also, if you want credits, you can get teaching credits as part of the training today and a certificate. So if you do the evaluation, you get all of that package in one, and then you can always go back to the recordings. So we have everything there for you. And I know a lot of people in the spring really did go back and looked at the recordings. We did get some feedback that was very helpful and useful to people. So again, we want to welcome you today. We're going to be thanking everyone for coming. And also I wanted to thank all of our sponsors, the ACES Task Force, the Delaware County Rural Healthcare Alliance, and Cornell Cooperative Extension of Delaware and Orange counties. I'm Jeannie Darling, Executive Director of Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I've been working with Karen Graves here at Extension in Delaware County. And we are, wanting to welcome everyone today and get our program started by introducing Ellie. And I know that she's excited about sharing information to you on this important topic. It's really focusing on chemicals in the environment today. Ellie actually is now a 5th year PhD student in the neuroscience program in Illinois University. And today she will be presenting some information, leading a discussion about how the brain develops and how toxicants like BPA and phthalates can mess with that process. And I know that she has more information about herself, so I'm going to actually have Ellie move right into her presentation, because I know she's going to provide some information and introduce herself as well in her presentation. So thank you so much, Ellie. We're excited and we appreciate having you with us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm Ellie, as you said, and I actually did my undergrad degree at Brown University on the East Coast. So nice to be talking to East Coasters again. And I've been at the University of Illinois for 5 years now, working in the neuroscience program. And my research focuses mainly on how these chemicals in our environment affect the developing brain. So that's what I'm going to share with you a bit today. But before we get really into things, I want to start with a question. How many of you have heard of BPA? You can just type a quick yes or no into the chat box here. All right, a few yeses, a few no's. Okay, great. So BPA, more answers rolling in. Great. Well, it's great because we're going to talk about it. I'm going to tell you what it is, what products it's found in, and how we can avoid it. So what about phthalates? This funky word, PHTH phthalates. Again, just a quick yes or no in the chat. All right, so I feel like maybe quite a few more no's this time, which is kind of what I expected. I first heard about phthalates when I joined the neuroscience program here and the Jurassic lab, and they were my project. And then I started learning what they are and everything that they're found in. So I'm excited to share that with you today. So to give you an idea of where I'm going, I'm going to start by talking about what phthalates and BPA are, what kind of products they're found in, and how we're exposed. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of how the brain develops and why this period of development is so important and also makes the brain particularly sensitive to the actions of these types of chemicals. And then we'll end spending quite a bit of time talking about how we can limit phthalates and BPA in our lives, which will help make us healthier. So phthalates and BPA are both what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. And that's because they disrupt the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is made up of glands throughout the body, and these glands make and secrete hormones, which are really specialized messengers that travel through the blood and act on different organs. So some hormones you might have heard of are cortisol, which is released in response to stress. So cortisol might act on the lungs and it'll make them dilate so that they absorb more oxygen. They act on the heart to increase your heart rate. On the pupils, they dilate your pupils so you can see better. Hormones also regulate your blood pressure. They're important for reproduction. So testosterone and estrogen might be two hormones you've heard of. And these hormones are actually quite important for brain development. So both males and females have estrogen and testosterone. It's just that females tend to have more estrogen, males have more testosterone, but both sexes have both of these hormones. Thyroid hormone is another hormone that's really important for the development of the brain. And the way hormones work is like a lock and key. So each hormone can only unlock a certain type of receptor. So estrogen can only unlock an estrogen receptor. Testosterone can only unlock an androgen receptor. So they're very specialized in that they can only bind to certain cells and certain receptors. And the way endocrine disrupting chemicals work is they mess with this process. They might prevent a key from finding a lock. They might mimic a key and make the body think that a hormone's present when it's really not. And that's how phthalates work. So phthalates are kind of like a bobby pin. You can envision it kind of that way, where they can interfere with multiple different hormone systems. Two receptors they can act on are the estrogen receptor, which typically only responds to estrogen, but phthalates can come in and unlock that receptor. They can also bind to androgen receptors, which usually only respond to testosterone. So in this way, phthalates trick the body into thinking hormones are there when they're actually not. So how do phthalates get into our bodies in the first place? Throughout the world, about 4.9 million metric tons of phthalates are made each year, and they go into products that we use every day. And the two main categories of products are personal care products and plastics. So in things like makeups, they help the makeup go onto the skin smoothly. In soaps and shampoo, conditioner, perfume, they're actually used to attach and stabilize fragrance, so they keep those products smelling fresh. Nail polish also, they help it go onto the nail smoothly, dry smoothly. And then in plastics, they're actually used in the enteric coating of pill capsules and also in IV bags and IV lines, and they help make these plastics more flexible. Some hospitals have started removing phthalates from their IV bags, actually, especially in the labor and delivery wings where premature babies are hooked up to IVs, because at this time, as we'll get into, the brain and body is really sensitive to the actions of these chemicals, so we want to minimize those. Phthalates are also responsible for the new car smell because they're used in this vinyl plastic that covers the dashboard. So when you smell a new car, that's phthalates that you're breathing in. And then they're also used in PVC pipes and other types of PVC plastic where they give it structure, so they help it stay stiff. The last place that phthalates are most commonly found is in food packaging and processing. And phthalates are attracted to fats. So when you have like a plasticky wrapper around burger or fries, it's likely that the phthalates are going to move out of that plastic and into the food you're eating. And our main source of exposure is from contaminated foods. So we're getting most of our phthalates from the foods that we eat that have come into contact with plastics. So now I'm going to turn and talk about BPA. BPA, or bisphenol A, is another endocrine disrupting chemical. And like phthalates, BPA can unlock the estrogen receptor. BPA is a little more specific in that in about the 1930s, scientists realized that BPA had this ability, that it could open the estrogen receptor. And they actually considered putting it on the drug market as a synthetic estrogen hormone replacement therapy. Around the same time, a different compound was discovered that worked a little bit better. It was more like a key than a bobby pin. It was more efficient at opening the estrogen receptor. So that one went to market. BPA was kind of put on the shelf. And in the 1950s, manufacturers realized that it actually made a very nice plastic coating and started putting it in the lining of cans to preserve food. It also was used and still is used on receipts. It gives receipts that glossy shine and finish. Where you might have heard of BPA before is in water bottles. So the plastics of water bottles, BPA makes that plastic flexible but strong and clear. So it's used in reusable water bottles. And mounting evidence has shown that BPA can really affect reproductive abilities and more recently affect the brain. And because of consumer pressure and also some research done by regulatory agencies, it actually has been removed from many products. So you might see water bottles or even food packaging in the grocery store that says BPA free on it. And this is great because, I mean, most of us are exposed to BPA. So when we can take it out of products, that's great. But it's being replaced with two different chemicals that are very similar to BPA. So these are called, two of them are BPS and BPF. And you can see that almost 90% of us are now exposed to BPS, have BPS in our bodies, about 66, 67% BPF. So even though something says BPA free, it doesn't necessarily mean it's free of these other chemicals, BPS and BPF. While we don't know as much about these and about what they can do and how they act in the body, they're so similar in structure to BPA that we hypothesize or think that they are likely having very similar actions. So more work needs to be done to understand how they are affecting the body. So at this point, I've told you a little bit about phthalates and BPA and how they act in the body. So now I want to turn and talk about the brain and why hormones are important when we're studying the brain. The brain is made up of these specialized cells called neurons. They receive messages from this end here, from all of these branches, and then they carry that message along and pass it off to a neighboring cell. This image here is showing neurons in green, and you can see that these neurons are highly interconnected. It almost looks like a spider web. And these neurons have to be connected because they have to talk to each other. Different parts of the brain have to communicate so that we can do things like see, understand language, make decisions, all of these types of functions. The connections between neurons are called synapses. And you can think of messages passing between cells like a phone call along a telephone wire. So the message bounces along from one cell to the neighboring cell. This image here is a neuron in the cell body is yellow. So that's the center of the cell. And then all of these green branches coming off of it are places where it is receiving messages. All the little red dots here are synapses. So this single cell is receiving messages from hundreds of other cells. So the job of the neuron is to integrate all of those messages and then refine that and send it on to the next cell. And that's how the brain communicates. One really important part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the region that my lab and I spend a lot of time studying. In humans, it sits in the front of the skull, in the frontal cortex. This part of the brain is broadly known for its involvement in executive function and kind of critical thinking. The prefrontal cortex specifically is very important for decision making. It kind of weighs logic against emotion and helps to make decisions. It's also important for working memory, which is your short-term memory. Like if someone gives you their phone number and you hold it in your mind long enough to write it down, that's working memory. Emotion regulation, so managing emotions and how they affect your decision-making and your actions. And that leads into impulse control. So the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in all of these things. And I want you to keep this in mind as we start talking about how phthalates and BPA affect certain behaviors and thinking abilities, because a lot of them are kind of in this area, in these categories. And when we study things like phthalates and BPA, there are limitations to what we can learn from humans. So in humans, we can study exposure and see how much of these chemicals our bodies are seeing. And we can do some correlations where if you're exposed to more of a chemical, there's a higher incidence of this outcome. But it's hard to get at the cause. So it's hard to see, for example, exactly what phthalates and BPA are doing in the brain. And so for this, we usually model exposure in rats. And rats also have a prefrontal cortex. So they have the same brain region, also in the front of the skull. And it's also important in these same functions. So rats also will make decisions. They can also remember things. So they use working memory, impulse control. We can measure all of these things in rats. And so now I want to talk a little bit about how the brain forms. This diagram is not to scale, but it highlights that most of the brain development and formation occurs in utero. So the first 9 months, the brain is growing like crazy. And in order for the brain to develop, there are 4 phases that it has to go through. So the first is the cells have to divide, they have to multiply, we need enough of them. And then those cells need to migrate or move to the right spot within the brain, where they then make connections. Remember, different brain regions and cells being connected is very important for communication between those cells. And that's what allows us to think. And the final phase of development is extra cells get pruned away. So extra cells will die. So this is, again, is a picture of the rat brain from the side. And if you were to cut along this line and look at the brain head on, it would look like this. So here the cells are stained in blue. The hole in the middle is completely normal. The brain's actually filled with these pockets where this fluid flows, and this helps to cushion and support and protect the brain. So the region where cells divide is around this hole where the staining is really, really dark in color. And once enough cells are formed, they divide and divide and divide. It becomes too crowded in this region and they have to go somewhere. So they start moving to their places in the brain. And you might wonder how they know where to go. And that is a very fair question. And there are specialized cells called radial glia that kind of lay out roads for the neurons to travel down. So in this diagram here, this pink cell is a neuron, and it's climbing along this glia cell, and it's just going to follow it until it reaches the end, and that's going to be its spot in the brain. So after the cells have moved to their positions, to the right spot in the brain, they start making connections. So this diagram are representative drawings of cells within the cortex during the first 2 years of life. And the first thing I want you to notice is that the number of cells here is not changing. So there's the same number of neurons in all of these pictures. The only thing that's changing is the branches. And these branches are what are making connections between the cells. So these cells are forming incredible numbers of synapses during the first 2 years. And forming synapses allows different parts of the brain to talk to each other. And when different parts of the brain can talk to each other and communicate, it allows for different abilities to come online, like being able to recognize faces or learning language, understanding speech, being able to talk yourself. All of these things happen as the brain becomes more and more interconnected. The last phase of brain development is extra cells being pruned away, or extra cells die. This is incredibly important because it's kind of a phase of removing distraction. So if you think of listening to a friend in a crowded party, it's hard to hear what they're saying. If you remove the distraction, you're able to hear that message loud and clear. And that's what the brain's doing. So it's getting rid of any distracting cells or cells that aren't contributing so that the conversation or the message can be heard and understood clearly. And the big message is that hormones are really important for all of these processes to happen. So testosterone, estrogen, thyroid hormone, and others are really critical and important for all of these phases of brain development. They play a very important role. So as I was alluding to, when the brain is changing or forming, it's susceptible to the environment. And this is a good thing in that it's kind of soaking in and taking in everything in the environment to learn and to grow. So the first thing that comes online are the senses, being able to see, smell, hear. These develop shortly after birth as the brain starts forming its first synapses. Shortly thereafter, language begins to come online. So you first start understanding what people are saying to you, and then you yourself start talking and being able to communicate. And that's followed by these higher cognitive abilities later in childhood. So reading, math, critical thinking, making decisions, those kinds of things. And so while the brain is relying on stimulation from the environment for these abilities to develop, it's also seeing maybe detrimental things in the environment, things like phthalates and BPA. So when the brain sees these early in development, they have a high likelihood of interfering with the development, with the formation of the brain and the connections that it's making. So the way that phthalates are studied and BPA in humans is through correlational studies. So what a study might typically look like is pregnant women would enroll in a study, and they would come in and either give a blood or a urine sample, and we would look at what the level of phthalates in their blood or urine. And then after they give birth, they might bring their child back, maybe right after birth, maybe at 2 years, 7 years, and would typically do a questionnaire or maybe some brief type of test to evaluate things like just general behaviors. So anxiety-like behaviors, problem solving, all of those types of things, attention. And then we correlate the levels of phthalates while the child was in utero with that behavioral outcome that we're measuring. And so early exposure to phthalates in utero has been correlated with many less than ideal outcomes. So inattention and hyperactivity, kind of symptoms of ADHD-like behaviors, aggression and conduct problems are most prevalent in males, whereas anxiety is more common in females. Lower IQ, as well as slowed sensory motor development. And this is how the brain is kind of connecting the senses with motor motion. So seeing an object in front of you and reaching for it is an example of this type of development. So that tends to develop quite early and can be an early indicator of maybe the detrimental or bad effects of phthalate exposure. There are a few limitations to studying phthalates in humans, though. The first is that these studies are all correlational. So there is no way to establish a cause. There's no way to show that phthalates are causing these outcomes. It's true that when phthalate exposure occurs, we're more likely to see these outcomes. But the only way to show direct cause would be to give pregnant women phthalates, which we are not going to do because they could be quite bad. Another problem is that there is no control group. Virtually no people who evade phthalate exposure. So virtually all of us have levels of phthalates in our bodies, and there's no way to compare against someone who has never been exposed to phthalates. So in order to really get at how phthalates are affecting the developing brain, we use an animal model. And this is developed and based off of human exposure. So a few years ago, Dr. Susan Shantz at the University of Illinois led the iKids cohort study, which brought pregnant women into the lab, and they measured the levels of phthalates in their urine to determine which phthalates they were exposed to and the level of exposure. And what they found was virtually 100% of these pregnant women had phthalates in their bodies. And these were the 6 most prevalent. There are upwards of 20 different phthalates, but these are the ones that are most commonly used in personal care products and in plastics. So they came up with this mixture here. And what we do is we expose pregnant rats to this same mixture at a dose that is exactly what humans would be exposed to. And then we look at what happens to their offspring and the development of their brains. So one thing to note about rats is that they're born very immature. They're born with their eyes closed. They can't see for the first few days after life. They can't keep themselves warm. They rely on their mother to survive. And so in terms of development, the first 10 days of life in a rat is equivalent to the last 3 months of human pregnancy. So to model exposure during pregnancy, we expose the rats to phthalates throughout gestation and for those first 10 days after birth. We give the rats a cookie with the phthalates on top of it. It's a liquid, so it just kind of absorbs into the cookie. And so they're exposed to phthalates during early development. And then what we do is we count the number of neurons or the number of cells in the prefrontal cortex of these animals that were exposed. And what we've seen is that animals exposed to phthalates have fewer neurons in the prefrontal cortex compared to those that were not. So the patterned bars here are the animals that were exposed to phthalates, and you can see they have fewer neurons than controls. This was the case in both males and females. Both the sexes were affected equally. And when we looked into this a little bit more, we saw that phthalates are actually increasing the amount of cell death occurring during early development. So that last phase of brain development where extra cells are pruned away, phthalates are causing too many cells to die. the pruning kind of goes overboard. And instead of just getting rid of distraction, it gets rid of some important cells too. And we saw this in a behavior test where the animals exposed to phthalates actually had impaired problem solving. They weren't as quick or as fast at solving problems compared to those that had never seen phthalates before. So now I've shown you that phthalates can disrupt how the brain develops, specifically by causing too many cells to die early in development. So now we'll shift to BPA. And what we know about BPA from human studies is you'll notice some of the outcomes are very similar to what's seen after early phthalate exposure. So high levels of BPA during pregnancy is associated with higher incidence of aggression and defiance in kids, as well as anxiety and depression, hyperactivity, poor working memory, and emotional control, as well as these are kind of two unique outcomes to BPA, social deficits and language delay. And so again, we turn to using a rat model to look at how BPA is acting in the developing brain and might be causing some of these outcomes. So again, we exposed developing rats to BPA while they were in utero and then for the first 10 days after birth. And we saw this time that males had too many neurons in the prefrontal cortex. So phthalates caused a loss of neurons. BPA is causing too many neurons, which you might initially think a lot of neurons is a good thing. But from that last phase of development of pruning, we've seen that BPA kind of prevents pruning. So instead of getting rid of distraction, all that distraction is left. And this leads to poor communication, especially within this region that's important for decision-making, attention, memory, all of those sorts of things. And as we kind of dug into this a little bit more, we also found that exposure to BPA during early development leads to changes in gene expression. So genes are the kind of directors of the cell. They tell the cell what to be and what to do. And in this case, we saw changes in genes that regulate the formation of synapses or the formation of those connections. So both changes in genes affecting how the cells are connecting and communicating, as well as having too many neurons in the prefrontal cortex, are two characteristics of autism. So these changes in gene expression and the excess of neurons in the prefrontal cortex are also seen in kids with autism. So we started thinking, what could we look at? What kinds of behaviors could we look at in these rats to see if they're causing something like autism? And we turned to social behavior. So there are social deficits seen in some cases of autism, and rats are very social creatures, so they're a good subject to use to model this. So what we do is we give the rats the option to hang out with another rat, with a buddy, or with a toy. And the toy was like a rubber cone. And we measure how much time they spend with the other rat compared to the time they spend with the toy. And we expect that rats will spend most of their time with the buddy. So these rats in the light blue here are spending almost 80% of their time with the other rat, with the buddy. But the males that were exposed to BPA in these darker bars spend significantly less time with the other rat. So these rats were less social. This is not what we would expect from a typical rat. They're choosing to play with a toy instead of a buddy. And so this kind of supports a lot of the human literature that shows early exposure to BPA is associated with some social deficits and language deficits that are characteristic of autism spectrum disorder. So at this point, we talked a bit about phthalates impacting the development of the brain and about BPA affecting the development of the brain. And we've seen that this early exposure period and early brain development is important, or the developing brain is most susceptible to the actions of these compounds. And because of that, phthalates and BPA tend to affect developing babies and infants the most. So while all of us should be aware of these chemicals and compounds and do our best to avoid them, they're going to have the biggest impact on developing babies and children. So I don't want you to think that phthalates can't hurt you once you're an adult. There's some data out there that shows that they can affect some things in adults, mainly reproductive abilities, but the effects on the brain, at least, are more subtle and perhaps in most cases less permanent than they are when we look at exposure to babies. And yes, if you're an adult who wants to get pregnant, it is very important or worthwhile to maybe go to extra effort to avoid these chemicals. So now we'll get into how we can dodge them, how we can minimize them in our lives. Because they are so widely used, we're not going to be 100% successful in getting rid of all phthalates and BPA in our bodies, but we can do things to limit how much we're exposed to. So the first thing comes when you choose personal care products. So the first thing I want to highlight is that you should go for products that are fragrance-free. And this is because phthalates, one of their main jobs in personal care products is to stabilize that fragrance, to keep it there so that the product continues smelling nice. And so because of the proprietary nature of fragrance, companies don't have to list phthalates out if they're included in that fragrance mixture, which they typically are. So if you see on the ingredients list, fragrance or parfum, those mixtures of fragrance could contain phthalates. It's not that they absolutely do, but they could, and there's no way to really know. So if you choose things that are fragrance-free, you know that there are no phthalates in that fragrance mixture because there is no fragrance. Fragrance-free is also not the same as unscented. In unscented products, they actually add fragrance to cover up the natural smell of the product. So unscented is the same as something that's scented in terms of adding fragrance to it. You want to go for something that's fragrance-free. You can also check the ingredient list for the words phthalate, or these are the three that are most commonly used in personal care products: DEP, DBP, and DIBP. There's a lot of acronyms in phthalates. So these are the three most common. So if you double check that those are not in your products, you should be good there. The next thing is water bottles. Water bottles are another source of exposure of both phthalates and BPA. And as plastic water bottles age, they release the chemical into the water or whatever the water bottle is holding. So the way like a plastic polymer looks, it's like a checkered pattern, and the phthalates and BPA kind of sit in the spaces and they give it that slight flexibility. So as the plastic degrades, it kind of opens up and the phthalates just kind of go out, or the BPA goes out into whatever liquids in those bottles. So when you replace your old water bottles, going for metal or glass is much better than plastic. And limiting the use of single-use plastic is also very good. When it comes to grocery shopping, as I've said, the primary source of exposure to phthalates and BPA actually is from food, contaminated food. So the more you can opt for fresh vegetables over canned, because the lining of cans still does contain BPA in many cases. And if it's BPA free, it could still contain those alternative chemicals that we don't know as much about, BPS and BPF. So going for fresh when you can. Frozen might be another good option, even though it's in the plastic packaging, because it's cold instead of hot. The phthalates and BPA are likely to stay in the plastic instead of coming into the food. And as I said, phthalates really like fat, so they're attracted to anything fatty. So limiting any packaged food, especially packaged food that has a high fat content, will limit or decrease your exposure to those chemicals there. When you store your food, especially hot food, you should try to use glass, because heat is another thing that draws these chemicals out of plastic. So if you cook something, warm pasta, and put it into a plastic Tupperware, it's likely that the chemicals in that plastic will come into your food. So where you can, using glass food storage is a good idea. And this is also why you should never microwave plastic. Never microwave your food in plastic, because, like I said, those chemicals will come right out of the plastic into your food. Another thing would be like leaving a plastic water bottle in the car on a hot summer day and then drinking it. If you've ever done that, you might notice the water tastes a little funky. There's a lot of chemicals that come out of the plastic and into the water when it's heated. The last couple things you can do are skipping the receipt. So receipts are lined with BPA or covered in BPA. It gives them that glossy shine and finish. And BPA can get into your blood through the skin. So when you grab a receipt, either wash your hands right after or say no, get a digital copy. The last thing is keeping your floors as clean as you can, especially if you have kids crawling around. BPA and phthalates accumulate in house dust. And because kids are the ones on the ground crawling around and putting things in their mouth, they're the ones that are coming into contact with it the most through that source. So as much as you can, minimizing dust is great to minimize exposure for kids that way. And I want to end by just talking a little bit about this recent report that was published actually in January or February, I believe. Some of the kind of leading toxicology researchers in the world of phthalates and BPA, Engel is one of them, Shauna Swan is another, published a report citing all the evidence out there that suggests early exposure to these compounds is bad for the developing brain. It can hurt the developing brain. So they cite studies in humans, but also a lot of studies done in rodent models that show this causative link, that early exposure to these chemicals can influence how the brain develops and lead to lasting changes in the structure of the brain and also how the brain is performing, how it works. So they are working hard to change legislation to further limit and ideally eliminate these compounds from products that are used by pregnant women and by kids. So currently there are some regulations on phthalates and BPA. There's regulations on about 8 phthalates in products used by kids, where the phthalates have to be less than 1% of the weight of the product. And there's a similar limit on BPA. BPA is also banned from use in baby bottles. That has been the case since about 2008. and infant formula and formula packaging. So that's great, but there are still steps that could be taken to further reduce the amount of these chemicals that are used in these sorts of products. So before taking any questions, I just want to thank the Juraska Lab. Dr. Janice Juraska is the PI, and all these past lab members who contributed to work that I talked about today, as well as our current member. Amara is the other grad student along with me. And I also want to acknowledge our funding. We're funded by the National Institute of Health. And at this point, I will take any questions. You can either type them into the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask, I'm happy to answer questions that way.
I'd like to thank you for this presentation. It's actually been very enlightening. One of my students works for a canning company, and they make thousands, hundreds of thousands of cans a day. And he took me to the factory because it's mostly automated.
Mm-hmm.
And he demonstrated to me how a process starts from a metal disc and is finally the finished can. And they do clean, they paint the inside of it with the, stuff that you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing to me to find out, like, a can of Budweiser has 6 layers of paint on the outside. It's amazing
Really?
the processing that goes into a can. And
Yes.
this really has been enlightening about I didn't realize how detrimental BPA can be. Thank you very much.
Yes, no problem. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, that's very interesting. All right.
I'd like to ask, how easy is it to find the contents on makeup and sunscreen and moisturizers and stuff like that?
So there are a handful of companies at least that advertise as phthalate free, and they are. It's hard because a lot of phthalates are hidden in that fragrance ingredient. But there is a website, the Environmental Working Group, EWG, and they have a skin deep database. And they list, you can actually type in the name of a product and they'll tell you if there are phthalates in it or not. And they also have lists of other of products that are known to be phthalate free. So that's Environmental Working Group.
So it's environmentalworkinggroup.com.
Database. If you Google that, EWG Skin Deep Database should come up, Environmental Working Group. All right, some other questions here. Can a blood lab test be ordered to check levels for adults? Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of now. Looking at levels involves a special type of machine, a mass spectroscopy, which evaluates how much of these chemicals are present. And typically that wouldn't be done at like a hospital or lab, but I also could be wrong. And if you talk to your doctor and they know of a test, or they know that a blood test like that could be done, that would be something to check on. You could also enroll in a research study like the ones that have been done here. There are many that are looking at exposure levels in humans across the country and the world. So another question, what about other chemicals you mentioned that are similar to BPA? Are those prohibited for use in baby products or not yet? Not yet. So not enough research has been done yet on those to prove or to show what their effects are. So that research is mounting, and I would expect something to be coming out relatively soon about that. I don't know how much of those chemicals are used or what replacements are used in those types of products, but it's likely to be one of those. So that's a good question. If you buy a product that's hard to find an option like BPA-free packaging, would it help to transfer it to glass or something after buying it? I would say, yeah. Depending on how long it's in the packaging, it could be soaking up more and more of the chemicals. So if you get it into glass after you buy it, that'll, stop that process right there. So that's a good strategy. Another question here. Can hand sanitizer help with removing BPA and phthalates on skin after handling receipts? That is a very good question. And I do not know. I do not know. I don't even want to guess. I'd say washing your hands with soap and water is probably best, but it won't hurt. Another question here, can saliva versus blood be used in trials? I hate blood draws. Yeah, some groups do use saliva. It's a little less accurate, like it fluctuates a bit more than blood, but that's why another common use is urine. So urine is another place to look for phthalates, and that's used quite a bit by groups that study this. Awesome questions.
We have a few more minutes, so if anybody else has other questions, but what an interesting area of research, Ellie.
Thank you.
I think, we need to know what's in the products that we're buying, right? And if there are
Yes.
chemicals that aren't good for us, it's something that we need to really focus on. I'm especially concerned about children.
Yeah.
Because, you have children that are dealing with so many emotional issues. We're having challenges, as you said, with a lot of the developing characteristics of children, that we want to make sure that we have as healthy a population, especially for children in our society as possible and throughout the world, right? So,
Definitely.
we need to watch this very carefully.
Absolutely. One more question came in about smelling perfume or the strong smell from hand sanitizer. I would guess hand sanitizer, what you're smelling mostly is going to be alcohol. So that is not like a phthalate or BPA. But in terms of smelling perfumes tend to have phthalates in them. So unless you get a phthalate-free perfume, then yeah, that scent is carrying that chemical through your nose into your airways where it can be absorbed.
Another thing, Ellie, I was thinking probably the fragrances that are free of all of these chemicals, they probably cost more too, right?
Yeah.
So that's another challenge, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we want to thank everybody again for joining us today, for Ellie for a wonderful presentation. And also want to encourage you to fill out the evaluation, give us feedback. If this is an area we could maybe do some more presentations on taking care of ourselves and watching how we actually purchase and prepare food and other products in our environment that might have detrimental chemicals for us as well as babies and children. It's very, very important. So thank you so much for everyone for being with us today, and especially Ellie for your presentation. Have a wonderful day. We hope to see you next Tuesday. We're going to be talking about the diet and some interesting research on antioxidants. So hope to see everyone again next Tuesday. If you can't join us, hop on, get the information in the recordings, fill out your evaluations and get your certificates. We're hoping everybody, can take advantage of all this important information this summer. So thanks again. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.